Hi guys, this first video is going to be about utilitarianism, and the first thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. So, all consequentialist views argue that whether or not an action is right or wrong is a function of whether or not that action maximizes or produces certain kinds of consequences. And utilitarians argue that whether or not an action is right or wrong is a function of whether or not an action maximizes overall happiness. It sounds pretty simple, but it actually requires quite a bit of unpacking. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the notion of happiness in utilitarianism. Happiness is a really difficult concept to work with. In particular, it's difficult because the way that we use the word happiness now is very different from the way that ancients or early moderns used to use the word. In particular, we say things like, "that made me really happy." And what we mean by that is that that made me feel a particularly pleasant way. I felt good about it. It was pleasant. It was enjoyable. We compare happiness to the feeling of joy, and we contrast it with the feeling of sadness. So when we say things like, "that made me really happy," we're building on a concept of happiness where happiness is a feeling. And that's very different from the way that the ancients or early moderns thought about the notion of happiness. For them, happiness wasn't a feeling. It was either a state or an activity, and it applied to your life as a whole. So one had a more or less happy life, but whether or not you had a more or less happy life wasn't necessarily just a matter of how you felt during your life. Instead, it was sort of importantly a matter of the success of your projects, whether or not you were a good person, and sort of general considerations about an individual's welfare. Utilitarians split on what they mean by happiness. For some of them, when they argued that that a right action maximizes happiness, what they mean is that a right action maximizes the sort of whoopee feelings that people have about a particular state of affairs or a particular course of events. But for other utilitarians, when they argue that people ought to maximize happiness, what they mean is something more like people ought to maximize welfare. And that's important because if you think of happiness in this way, then you can maximize happiness even if people don't feel necessarily good about the particular outcome or the particular course of events. So happiness can be separated from the way that people feel about things. Hi guys, we're going to switch gears at this point and talk a little bit about utilitarians and their decision-making procedure. Remember that utilitarians argue that the right action is that action that maximizes overall utility, and this actually suggests some pretty clear-cut decision-making procedures. The first thing that a utilitarian is going to do is that they're going to determine who the relevant stakeholders are. And there are three important things to keep in mind with this. The first is that the stakeholders have to be determined accurately. You don't want to construe that too narrowly or too broadly. So in certain situations, it might be the case that the decision could affect the entire society and that the welfare of society as a whole needs to be taken into account. In other cases, it might be the case that the only relevant stakeholders are the decision maker and one other person. The other thing to keep in mind is that all of the stakeholders are equal. The decision maker can't show any bias towards one party over another. And finally, it needs to be the case that all of the parties' happiness is commensurate. That is, you can measure the effects of a particular action on a person's happiness and compare that with the effects on another person's happiness. The second step is to determine the set of available options to the utilitarian. Now, one of the mistakes that people frequently make when they're thinking in terms of ethics is that they typically see things in terms of black or white. I can either censor or I cannot censor. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that, and we usually face a lot wider choices when we're trying to make these sorts of ethical decisions. So to use the example of censorship, we often think in terms of, well, I could either censor the book or I could not. But we actually might do lots of different things. We might apply labels to the book and say that we think that it's false, or we might keep the book behind the counter and ask people to, check with us before they're able to get the item. We might put age restrictions on it. So there are lots of different sorts of things that we might do, and the utilitarian is going to need to sort of identify each of the available options. And finally, the third step is that the utilitarian is going to need to do a cost-benefit analysis to determine how each of the options are going to affect the happiness of each of the particular stakeholders. So they're going to weigh the costs and benefits for each particular agent, and then compare and finally choose that option which maximizes overall happiness.